Who really wrote the Torah, Pentateuch? The authorship of the books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy is a topic of extensive scholarly debate. Traditionally, religious traditions have attributed them to Moses himself. However, modern biblical scholarship, particularly the documentary hypothesis and related theories, suggests that these books are a composite of multiple sources written by different authors over several centuries. Let's examine the evidence and expose the undeniable truth. Moses did not write a single word of the books falsely attributed to him. Part 1. The Documentary Hypothesis, JEDP. Most modern scholars accept that the Torah is a compilation of at least four main sources: J. Yahwist, E. Elohist, D. Deuteronomist, and P. Priestly. The Yahwist source, J, is one of the oldest and most distinct traditions within the documentary hypothesis, tracing back to around the 10th-9th century BCE, likely during Israel's early monarchy under King Solomon or his successors. This source is a bold declaration of identity, defined by several explosive features. A. It slams the door on ambiguity by consistently referring to God as Yahweh, from the get-go. Unlike later sources that dance around with different divine names, the Yahwist's unwavering use of Yahweh asserts that Israel's God has always been known by this name, directly challenging the later claims, like those of P, that insist Yahweh was only revealed to Moses. This is a theological statement that leaves no room for doubt. B. The Yahwist doesn't settle for a distant deity. Instead, it paints God in vividly anthropomorphic terms. We see Yahweh walking in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:8, interacting personally and directly with humanity. This isn't some abstract force. Yahweh talks face-to-face with Adam, Cain, and Abraham. None of that vague dream or vision nonsense found in later texts. In Genesis 2, Yahweh physically shapes Adam from the dust, showcasing an intimacy that screams involvement rather than the impersonal spoken word of creation found in the priestly source. C. The Yahwist's narrative style is rich, dramatic, and story-driven, packed with deep character development and emotional interactions that keep you engaged. The fall of man, Genesis 3, is not just a tale of disobedience. It's a morally complex confrontation where Yahweh is personally entangled with Adam, Eve, and the serpent. The Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, offers a humorous, almost satirical jab at human arrogance, where Yahweh literally has to come down to set things straight. The lives of the patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, are infused with real struggles, strong personalities, and direct relationships with Yahweh that make them relatable and vivid. D. The Yahwist stories are rooted in a southern Judahite perspective. Scholars agree this source likely emerged in Judah, often elevating figures and locations tied to the southern kingdom. The focus on Abraham, connected to Judah's lineage, dwarfs figures like Joseph, who's more aligned with the northern kingdom. There's an implicit emphasis on Jerusalem as a sacred center, even when it's not explicitly named. This isn't accidental. E. Unlike the rigid legalism of later sources, like the priestly writer, the Yahwist presents a more human-centered theology. This is a God who is emotional and responsive, capable of changing his mind based on human actions. In Genesis 6:6, Yahweh regrets creating humanity before the flood, and in Exodus 32:14, he relents from wiping out Israel after Moses pleads for them. The Yahwist J source delivers a deeply personal, vivid portrayal of a God who isn't some distant abstract concept. He is near, emotional, and intimately involved in human affairs. It's a powerful testament to storytelling over legalistic rigidity, and it lays bare a relationship with the divine that is alive, dynamic, and profoundly human. The Elohist tradition is a powerhouse of the documentary hypothesis, emerging from the northern kingdom of Israel after the split from Judah around 930 BCE. It delivers a starkly different theological and literary perspective, making it a formidable counterpart to the earlier Yahwist J source. From the outset, the Elohist refuses to call God by the personal name Yahweh, opting instead for Elohim until Exodus 3:14-15. When Yahweh reveals his name to Moses. This choice isn't mere semantics. It underscores a theological stance that suggests God's personal identity was unknown before this revelation. This is a sharp contrast to the Yahwist's portrayal of a God who has always been present and intimately involved. In the Elohist tradition, God is depicted as a less anthropomorphic and more distant figure than in the Yahwist source. Here, divine communication doesn't happen through direct encounters. Instead, God speaks through dreams, visions, and intermediaries. Angels and messengers serve as buffers between the divine and humanity. Just look at Moses' calling at the burning bush, Exodus 3. Yahweh doesn't physically show up, he communicates through fire. The binding of Isaac, Genesis 22, further exemplifies this, where an angel steps in to stop Abraham instead of God himself intervening directly. This shift reflects a northern Israelite theological tradition that perceives God as powerful yet distant, far less involved in the nitty-gritty of human affairs compared to the Judahite Yahwist tradition. The Elohist source places a heavy emphasis on prophecy, fear of God, and moral responsibility, themes that resonate with the Northern Kingdom's values. Abraham is portrayed as a prophet, Genesis 27, while Moses is elevated as a mediator between God and the people. The story of Joseph showcases the importance of dream interpretation, reinforcing the idea that divine messages are more significant than personal interactions. In the Elohist narrative, divine justice reigns supreme. God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. But this happens in a more legalistic, detached manner than the relational dynamics presented by the Yahwist. Originating in Israel, the Elohist tradition subtly elevates northern figures and locations over their southern counterparts. Ephraim, a major northern tribe, takes precedence over Judah, and sites like Shechem and Bethel, critical northern worship centers, are emphasized. There's also an undercurrent of anti-Judahite and anti-monarchical sentiment, particularly in its critique of kingship. This political and regional distinction is crucial, as it highlights a separate religious tradition that competes directly with the Judah-centered Yahwist narratives. Unlike the Yahwist, which flows as a continuous narrative, the Elohist source is often fragmented. Much of its content was later edited and merged with the Yahwist source, J, to form the JE tradition around the 7th century BCE. This merging means that the Elohist's original, independent form is largely obscured today, resulting in its material appearing inconsistent or scattered throughout Genesis and Exodus. The Elohist source presents a God who is distant and transcendent, communicating through dreams, angels, and prophetic visions rather than through personal encounters. It embodies the Northern Kingdom's theological traditions, emphasizing prophecy, morality, and divine justice, while subtly critiquing the southern Judahite monarchy. Despite its fragmented state, the Elohist provides a critical counterpoint to the Yahwist's more personal, Judah-centered theology and played an essential role in shaping the biblical narrative landscape. The Deuteronomist D source represents a major theological and political shift in ancient Israelite religion. Unlike the earlier Yahwist and Elohist sources, which are primarily narrative-driven, the Deuteronomist is highly legalistic and reformist, focusing on centralized worship, obedience to divine law, and national identity. This source is closely associated with King Josiah's religious reforms, 2 Kings 22:23, which aimed to eliminate polytheism, centralize worship in Jerusalem, and purify Israelite religion by aligning it with the laws found in the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law. The Deuteronomist makes one thing clear: Yahweh alone must be worshipped, and nowhere but Jerusalem. The older Israelite traditions of local shrines, high places, and rural altars, outlawed, erased, purged. Deuteronomy 12:5-14 lays it out. Sacrifices and worship belong only in the Jerusalem temple. This wasn't just theology, it was political consolidation. Josiah's so-called reform, c. 622 BCE, was a full-scale religious purge, dismantling centuries-old worship practices and seizing power under the guise of divine command. Any rival religious site was to be destroyed, and any practice outside Jerusalem's control was deemed heretical. This wasn't just about faith, it was about absolute control. The Deuteronomist doesn't just recount Israel's history. They rewrite it to fit a narrative that screams one thing: obey or suffer. Their twisted ideology claims that compliance leads to blessings, while defiance brings destruction, and they back it up by crafting the Deuteronomistic history. This isn't just storytelling, it's a manipulative strategy embedded in Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. They blame the fall of the Northern Kingdom in 722 BCE squarely on idolatry and disobedience, casting a shadow of divine punishment over every misstep. It's a relentless cycle of reward and retribution designed to keep the people in line, reinforcing a message that echoes through history. Stray from the path, and you'll pay the ultimate price. The Deuteronomist's covenant with Yahweh is not some warm, fuzzy promise. It's a cold, hard ultimatum. Obey the laws, and you will prosper. Disobey, and you will suffer. War, famine, and exile are your only rewards for defiance. This isn't the unconditional love and grace found in earlier covenants, like God's promise to Abraham in the Yahwist tradition, where the divine commitment stands firm regardless of human failure. No, this is a transactional relationship that demands unwavering loyalty, and if you dare to stray, you better be ready to face the consequences. It's a brutal reminder that with the Deuteronomist, there are no free passes. It's obedience or destruction, plain and simple. In 2 Kings 22:23, we see the so-called discovery of a lost book of the law during Josiah's reign. But let's not kid ourselves. This was no accident. It was a strategic power play. This book, likely an early version of Deuteronomy, served as the perfect excuse for Josiah to unleash a religious cleansing that would make any tyrant proud. He went on a rampage, purging idolatry, demolishing pagan altars, and enforcing a centralized worship that put all control squarely in his hands. And guess what? The Deuteronomist wasn't just a passive observer. They were right there in the trenches, writing and editing parts of the Torah to back Josiah's tyrannical reforms. This was a calculated move to legitimize his authoritarian grip on religion and solidify his reign, all under the guise of divine approval. The priestly source, P, one of the key components of the documentary hypothesis, is thought to have emerged in the 6th-5th century BCE, likely during or after the Babylonian exile. This source stands apart from the earlier Yahwist J and Elohist E traditions by its distinct emphasis on ritual, genealogy, and priestly concerns, reflecting a community grappling with its identity and religious practices in the aftermath of exile. The priestly source prioritizes detailed instructions for ritual practices, sacrifices, and festivals. It outlines the regulations for the priesthood, the structure of worship, and the importance of maintaining purity and holiness within the community. This reflects a growing concern for proper worship and adherence to religious laws, particularly in a post-exilic context, where the community sought to redefine its identity and restore its covenant relationship with God. A notable characteristic of the priestly source is its focus on genealogies and lineages. The text meticulously traces the lineage of the priestly families, especially the descendants of Aaron, establishing a clear authority structure within the priesthood. These genealogies serve not only to legitimize the priesthood, but also to connect the present community to their ancestral heritage, reinforcing their identity as a chosen people. The priestly source contributes a distinct version of the creation narrative found in Genesis 1. This account emphasizes God's sovereign power, order, and the goodness of creation, with a structured, systematic presentation that highlights the importance of the Sabbath. In contrast to the more personal and anthropomorphic accounts of the Yahwist tradition, the priestly account presents a transcendent God who commands the creation of the world with authority. The priestly source, P, a pivotal element of the documentary hypothesis, emerged in the 6th-5th century BCE, likely in the shadow of the Babylonian exile. This source decisively breaks away from the earlier Yahwist J and Elohist E traditions, wielding a distinct focus on ritual, genealogy, and priestly authority. It reflects a community in turmoil, desperate to reclaim its identity and religious practices in the wake of exile. Part 2. Linguistics. The Hebrew of the Torah is a chaotic blend of dialects that scream multiple time frames, shattering any illusion of a single author. You've got early Hebrew reflecting archaic forms from the pre-monarchic period, circa 1200 to 1000 BCE, echoing the linguistic style of the Song of Deborah and early prophetic literature. Then there's the classical Hebrew from the monarchic period, circa 1000 to 586 BCE, mirroring the formality of royal courts and religious institutions. Finally, you can't ignore the post-exilic Hebrew in the priestly source, showing a vocabulary and syntax that align closely with texts birthed during or after the Babylonian exile. This linguistic mishmash obliterates the idea of a unified voice, revealing a text crafted over centuries by various hands and minds, each leaving their mark on this ancient narrative. The vocabulary of the Torah is littered with words and phrases that scream specific time periods, revealing the text's messy evolution. Terms tied to ritual practices are steeped in the priestly concerns of the exilic community, showcasing their desperate push to re-establish religious norms. The grammar and syntax are a battlefield of variations. You see older forms creeping into narrative sections, while the later legal texts flaunt a more formalized structure. Then there are the loanwords and phrases that expose the text's cultural interactions, especially during the chaotic periods of exile and return. These elements from Akkadian and Aramaic highlight a clear exposure to Babylonian culture and administration, underscoring the Torah as a tapestry woven from diverse linguistic threads. The themes and theological concerns in the texts also reflect changes over time. For instance, the shift from a more personal and anthropomorphic view of God in earlier sources to a more transcendent and ritual-focused portrayal in later texts aligns with the evolving religious landscape of the Israelite community. Part 3. Influence of Mesopotamian and Canaanite literature. The parallels between Genesis and Exodus and earlier Mesopotamian myths are glaring and undeniable. The flood story, for instance, mirrors the Epic of Gilgamesh, which features a hero named Utnapishtim who builds a massive boat to survive a divine deluge meant to wipe out humanity. This Mesopotamian account, like the biblical narrative, emphasizes the theme of divine judgment and mercy, with both stories showcasing the hero's preservation of life through his obedience to divine instructions. Within Genesis 6-9, we not only find the familiar tale of Noah, but also multiple conflicting accounts of the flood's duration and scope, illustrating a patchwork of traditions that complicates the narrative. The creation narrative in Genesis presents two distinct accounts that not only echo themes found in the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian epic about the creation of the world through the conflict between gods, but also showcase significant differences between themselves. Genesis 1 depicts a structured, orderly process in which God creates the universe in 6 days, culminating in the creation of humanity in his image, emphasizing God's sovereignty and power through divine speech. In contrast, Genesis 2 offers a more intimate portrayal, focusing on the formation of man from the dust and the subsequent creation of woman from man's rib, highlighting the personal relationship between God and humanity. While both accounts share the theme of cosmic order arising from chaos, the biblical narrative frames God as a singular creator, starkly contrasting with the polytheistic elements of the Enuma Elish. This illustrates how the biblical authors reinterpreted and adapted existing themes to convey their theological messages, establishing a unique framework that underscores their distinct religious identity. And let's talk about the laws laid out in Exodus and Deuteronomy. They bear striking similarities to the Code of Hammurabi, an ancient Babylonian law code known for its detailed regulations governing various aspects of life. The biblical laws, while distinctive in their moral and ethical emphasis, show a clear borrowing of legal concepts and structures from Hammurabi's code, particularly in matters of justice and social order. This highlights how deeply entrenched these influences are, suggesting that the biblical writers were not creating in a vacuum, but rather engaging with and adapting the legal traditions of their time. It's clear. The biblical writers didn't just pull these stories from thin air. They rehashed and adapted existing myths to fit their narrative, proving that the roots of these tales lie far beyond the boundaries of ancient Israel. Part 4. Internal evidence against Mosaic authorship. The evidence against Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch is glaring and undeniable. First off, the text frequently refers to Moses in the third person, saying things like, "And the Lord spoke to Moses." If Moses were the author, this awkward perspective would be absurd. Then there's the account of Moses' death in Deuteronomy 34. How on earth could he have written that? And let's not ignore the anachronisms peppered throughout the text. Genesis 36-31 mentions the kings of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites, which screams of an author with knowledge of an Israelite monarchy that didn't exist until centuries after Moses. Plus, you've got place names like Dan in Genesis 14:14, which reflect a historical context that flat out contradicts the supposed time of Moses. The inconsistencies pile up, making it clear that Mosaic authorship is nothing but a myth. The laws and instructions found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy reveal significant contradictions and inconsistencies that challenge the notion of a single, cohesive legal framework. For instance, in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments are presented as foundational moral principles, but later instructions in Exodus 21 to 23 introduce a more complex and often harsher legal code that seems to contradict the original spirit of the commandments. Leviticus further complicates matters with an extensive array of ritual laws and purity regulations, many of which appear to be at odds with the ethical guidelines established in Exodus. Additionally, Deuteronomy revisits and revises many laws, often adding conditions or changing penalties, which raises questions about the consistency of divine instruction. This conflicting nature of the laws across these texts suggests multiple sources and stages of development within the Israelite legal tradition, highlighting the complexity of their cultural and religious evolution, rather than a singular, unified authorship ascribed to Moses.